Hej och välkomna till ett nytt avsnitt av AIM Talks där vi har bjudit in två gäster från USA, det är Kitty Kurth och Jim Arkedis, för att prata om den väldigt uppmärksammade politiska situation som har uppstått i samband med de stora demonstrationerna och upploppen där. Tanken är att vi ska försöka sätta in det här i ett sammanhang och förstå vad som har hänt, men framförallt försöka förstå vad det här kan innebära för politiken framöver. Yeah, welcome Kitty and Jim. You both work as, would you describe yourself as an advisor? You know a lot about US politics, as I take it.
Yeah, definitely. Campaigning, international campaigning advisor. How's that?
Yeah, great. And I take it, Jim, you live in Washington D.C. and Kitty, you in Chicago. How have the last days been at your place in your towns? Has it been a lot of riots or demonstrations in the streets, or how is it at your terps?
Well, at our condo in Chicago, and we live in the central city, all the grocery stores have been looted. All the Main Street stores on Michigan Avenue have been looted. As for those of you who've been in Chicago, you know we have both our wonderful lake and a river that runs through Chicago, and all of the bridges on the river have been put in the up position so that people can't go from north to south, with the exception of like one or two bridges. The expressway entrances are cut off so that you can't get from the highway into the central city. The CTA has, the transit system has stopped running. The commuter rail has stopped running. We are hoping that today they will be reinstituted, but protesting started in our normal way. We're in Chicago. We are a very vocal people. We protest frequently, peacefully. The police usually cooperate with us. They sometimes, they help. They want to keep people safe normally. But this weekend, it wasn't that way. And out in the neighborhoods is where the pain will really be felt, because communities where community members have worked so hard for years to get grocery stores and pharmacies into areas that we called food deserts that had no grocery stores and no pharmacies. Now the stores are gone again, and we won't.
So it's a pretty bad situation, if I sum it up.
Yes, and I am sitting here in my white privilege 100 miles away in Wisconsin, and things are fine here, except even in our tiny town here, there were protests last night on both sides. There were people at the church protesting to support George Floyd and I Can't Breathe, and then there were other people, the Reopen Wisconsin people were protesting against them. So even in a tiny town, things have taken off.
Yeah, how is it in Washington D.C.? I saw the Swedish morning news show on television this morning, and there was a journalist reporting live from D.C. there, getting tear gas, so he had to change location to be able to report. How is it in your place?
It's not good. Very much, very similar picture to what's going on in Chicago in many ways. I think one of the most important things to state and is to reiterate something that Kitty just said. Both her and I, as white people of privilege in America, just cannot fundamentally understand how deeply these assaults on the African American community have affected people, and how much during this moment it has touched a nerve of protest and challenge of national leadership in a way that very few things have over the course of the last several decades. So in Washington, D.C., there have been a lot of pictures over the last few days as the epicenter of and the focal point of much of our national conflict and our national pain. You have protesters, the vast majority of whom have been peaceful, even though there's a lot of graffiti and there are smashed windows on storefronts and churches that have had fires set to them. But the vast majority of people have been peacefully protesting. while you have a president trying to proclaim himself as the law and order president, in contradiction with the vast majority of Americans. Early polling numbers show 2/3 plus of the country supports the protests around George Floyd's murder. Yet you had a group of peaceful protesters in Washington, D.C. who were dispersed by tear gas and flashbang grenades to create a photo op for Donald Trump to walk to a church and try and appropriate the image of God as one that was implicitly supporting him and his political standing, which is just so incredibly obnoxious. And then the last thing I'll say very quickly is the Trump administration has tried to use DC to flex its muscles and show force. And so all you have to do is spend 30 seconds on Twitter and search for images of massive military machines rolling down 14th Street and 16th Street in my neighborhood to try and show that Donald Trump was somehow taking charge of the situation, which is just so deeply offensive to the vast majority of peaceful protesters who want racial and social justice in this country.
And this is what I think is different and scary. And you make an excellent point, Jim. That's what we don't have in Chicago. We have our police presence, but this militarization in Washington and calling out the U.S. military against the U.S. citizens, this is unprecedented and frightening to me as a historian.
Absolutely.
When was the last time we saw demonstrations and riots of this scale? Was it like in 2003 during the Iraq War? Or do we have to step back to 1968 during the Vietnam War? Or if you gave us any reference points, what would you say?
For Chicago, it's 1968 when the Democratic National Convention was here and when the whole West Side was burned. And you know, honestly, some of those neighborhoods were just getting back from 1968, and now we've got to start all over again. But I think for Chicago, 1968 is the marker. Jim, maybe you can speak to DC.
I mean, Washington D.C. is a city of protest in many ways. I mean, after Trump was elected, we had the Women's March here just a few months later. After children were slaughtered in a school in Florida, we had the March for Our Lives against gun violence, where you saw hundreds of thousands of people in the streets for days on end. So in terms of scale, the number of people in the streets, particularly during the time of a global pandemic, and I cannot help but watch all of those people quite literally risking their lives to go out and stand up for what they believe in, because many of them could become very sick. Thanks to coronavirus and thanks to the Trump administration's utter failure to provide any semblance of a coherent public health strategy to control the disease. So you may see comparable numbers to what we've seen before in recent years in terms of numbers of people in protesting, but underlying those protests is a feeling that something is fundamentally changing in this country. That because of the global health situation, people are still taking their lives in their hands to go out and express themselves in a way. They're assuming risks that perhaps people haven't for many years.
Were you both guys? Yeah, Niklas.
One thing I've been that I think has been very scary has also been the development of the president being very much on the side of both in practical ways, like he did when they cleared the streets with tear gas and flashbangers so he could do this photo op of the church, but also deploying the military. But earlier he was also encouraging people to take on weapons to protest when it comes to the lockdown. And I think it was in Michigan they were really showing the weapons outside of the capital in Michigan and outside of the governor's residence and so on. Is something I haven't heard before in modern time in America. Is that new for you as well?
Yes, and this is what's happening here. If you look out the window, you can see I'm in the country. In our small town, I was very curious to see the protests yesterday in our town, but I didn't go because on social media, this reopen Wisconsin, which is akin to the reopen Michigan where they showed up with the guns, they were saying that they were also going to be protesting in our town today. And Nicholas, I live, as you know, in an area where lots of my neighbors are hunters. People have guns. And Trump's encouraging of the guns is frightening. And can I put on my tinfoil conspiracy hat for a minute, you guys? So, Jim, you brought it up, but I think Trump is encouraging people to go out and protest and is ginning up the protests and the violence to prevent people from social distancing and to try to get more people sick with coronavirus and to try to kill more Black and brown people. I think he is being very deliberate in wanting to stir social unrest and not only make people stop thinking about the pandemic, but to make more people infected with the pandemic. And again, that might be my conspiracy theory hat, but it keeps me up at night worrying.
My reaction Jim, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, Kitty, I hope that that's a bridge too far. I think it's a bridge too far for, I don't actively, I hope, and I don't think that Trump is actively wanting to infect more people, particularly amongst the African American community. But it is certainly important to note infection rates among the African American community and among the Hispanic community far outweigh those amongst the Caucasian white communities. And as to Nicholas's question about reopening and the armed protesters, it's what is so striking and so disheartening is the lack of national leadership. Trump has essentially just become tired of this coronavirus outbreak. You see a lot of reporting where he said behind the scenes, why is this happening to me now? Why couldn't I have just had a good economy? And the issue that I keep coming back to is you can't control what happens all the time as president of the United States or anybody. The issue is once something happens to you, how do you react? Do you react with competence and foresight in a way that protects Americans and brings us to a better place, a better unified place? Or, as we've seen Trump revealed, as much as we can, he doesn't have the patience to deal with the problem. He wishes it never happened. He's been calling it a hoax. He's been trying to divide Americans by encouraging protests. He's been trying to divide Americans by having them ignore even his own public health advice that has come from his experts in the White House. It speaks to a fundamental lack of character and lack of fitness for office that we could not have seen in any way, shape, or form better than by this coronavirus pandemic, and complicated, of course, by the killing of George Floyd.
When I saw Trump making a speech a day or a couple of days ago, I thought that I was seeing a kind of revitalized president. Now we have find a new message. He will be the strong leader, the kind of law and order guy that cleans the mess up in the USA. Do you think that will be the kind of message he will try to run on this autumn?
I think he's exhausted all other options, and I think he's trying to run the Richard Nixon playbook. I'm the law and order president. You white people in the suburbs, you need to elect me or everything's going to hell in a handbasket. I also think that I never thought that I would say this about my own country, the United States. I think each American needs to be vigilant to make sure that the elections are not interfered with, that the elections are not postponed, that they don't try to say, oh, things are too dangerous, there's too much pandemic, we can't have elections in November. I think I say that a little bit in a world of fiction, but every day and everything that happens makes it closer to reality. We need to, democracy is a muscle that you need to exercise. And in the United States, as much as people are thinking about protesting, people need to be thinking about voting, and people need to be thinking about making sure that they're going to be able to vote in November. I've been very happy that Joe Biden has put out some powerful statements in the last few days, but I feel they're being overshadowed by news all over the country.
I think that you, Andreas, ask a very interesting point about the strongman issue, because there was a moment for Donald Trump to embrace his strongman tendencies. And that moment was during the beginnings of the coronavirus pandemic. If he had stepped up to the microphone and said, "That's it, I'm in charge, here's what we're going to do. We're going on national lockdown for 2 months, and we're going to beat this thing, and you're all going to listen to me." I think that the situation was so grave that America at that point was willing to give the commander-in-chief the leeway needed to keep the country safe. However, he dithered, he deflected, he blamed others, he blames China, he's trying to blame Biden, Democrats, Obama, you name it, right? And America saw through that. And if you look at the poll numbers, and one of my jobs right now is working on an independent expenditure committee supporting Joe Biden, and all I do is look at the numbers all day. It was a real missed opportunity for Trump. And now that he's moving into this law and order speech that we saw in the Rose Garden at the White House the other day, it's very clear that not only has Trump missed his motive there, or missed his moment there, but that Americans realize the just cause behind the protesters supporting justice for George Floyd's murder. And on the progressive side, our challenge is to keep this framework of national debate focused more on social justice, about reforming police who are overly brutal, about ensuring racial equality, rather than taking the bait and responding to Donald Trump's attempts to drag the national conversation into one of law and order. And that ultimately is why it's so important that protests must remain strong, but must remain peaceful.
Yeah, but that leads to the next question. Where is Joe Biden and the Democrats in all this? What can they do? Because, I mean, all political and media focus will, of course, focus on the president and Trump now these days. Can Biden do anything at all?
He can, and he's been stepping up his activity in the last couple of days, which I've been very happy to see, and he's had some really strong messages, but he has to push in social media more. He has to push in national media more. And I think that the national media, who are afraid of Trump's strongman tendencies, and I think you're right, Jim, I think he had an opportunity and lost it. And I think people might have even embraced it because people were looking for guidance. The national media needs to not be attracted by the bright, shiny object of the moment, and they have to at least put some energy and focus and emphasis on the fact that there is a campaign going on and that there are two candidates, and they need to start letting the political dialogue surface again.
Yeah, I think for all intents and purposes, the national election kicked off yesterday. Joe Biden gave a wonderful, heartfelt speech in which he drew a very strong contrast with Donald Trump yesterday in Philadelphia. He talked about not wanting to fan the flames of fear, about bringing the country together, about the importance of social justice and racial equality. That it could not have been a stronger contrast to Donald Trump. And I encourage everybody to go look up the speech. Second, in the coming days, I believe it's tomorrow, there'll be the memorial for George Floyd in Minneapolis, and Joe Biden is going to go attend. And this is really, he's taken a lot of criticism for, being the guy, hiding out in his basement during the initial stages of this campaign as the coronavirus pandemic was taking over so much. Now you're seeing there's been a little bit of a recession in the worries about public health, and Biden has begun to move around a little bit, and he'll be traveling a little bit more. From now on, everything Donald Trump says provides an incredible window for Joe Biden to basically what we call in American political campaigning strategy, bracket Donald Trump. So Trump is going to give a speech here. Biden can say something before and after it. Donald Trump is always going to command the vast majority of media attention because he's not only the president, but he's loudmouth Donald Trump. But now the media is going to pay attention to everything that Joe Biden says, and they're going to place it within the context of press stories to bring out that contrast.
And Joe Biden has already modeled leadership behavior. He's shown empathy. He's talked about coronavirus victims. When he went on Memorial Day to visit the cemetery, he and Dr. Biden both wore masks, used appropriate social distancing. He's already leading by example, and he needs to continue to do that.
In the midterm election 2018, you could see a movement from especially women in the suburbs going to the Democrats. Will they be scared now and go back to the Republicans and Trump, or what do you think about that movement we saw, or is it a movement that will continue in this general election?
You have asked the $64,000 question, Niklas Nordström. That's what will decide this election, is what do those suburban women do? Do Black voters use the George Floyd stuff as a organizing tool and decide everybody's going to show up and vote, or do they decide we've had enough, screw it, we're not going to come to the table? But those suburban women, the younger voters, the African American women are key to the success of the Democratic Party. If they use these moments of unrest as an organizing tool, the Democratic Party will win. If they become completely frustrated, the Democratic Party is in huge trouble. But those white suburban women are Donald Trump's margin of victory. If the Democrats can continue to attract them the way they did with Gretchen Whitmer's election, the way they did with the election of the Democratic governor in Wisconsin and Kentucky, the Democratic Party is in good shape. If not, Trump has 4 more years and the world is in big trouble.
And when we talk about that law and order message, even though what Trump said during his White House speech the other night was significantly overshadowed by this ridiculous spectacle of them, using tear gas and the flashbang grenades to clear a path for Trump to walk to this church, which was just a few hundred meters in front of the White House. That got most of the news coverage. But if you are a suburban woman who maybe hasn't voted for too many Democrats before in her life, but you're generally disgusted by Trump and you're considering voting for Joe Biden, they are probably tuned into the speech that Trump makes where he talks about law and order and wanting to control violent protests. And so I'm concerned that kind of message is going to resonate with those swing voters, Nicholas.
One thing I've been thinking about is that there will be a very special election summer.
We are standing by waiting for instruction. Fortunately, I'm standing by a half-hour drive from the convention site, so I can get there on a moment's notice if anybody needs me. But also, you notice me sitting here in Wisconsin, and as Nicholas and Andreas, usually at this time of the year, I'm on the road somewhere with Joe Biden setting up for the next campaign event. And I'm not on the road, and we're not setting up for the next physical campaign event. So it is going to be a most unusual summer, and every day makes a difference.
It's also important to talk about the ridiculous spectacle that has become the Republican National Convention, which was supposed to be held in Charlotte, North Carolina. As everybody knows, Donald Trump loves nothing more than a massive crowd. Massive crowds are probably not very safe to have in the current environment. Trump began insisting to the governor of North Carolina, who is the Democrat, that the state of North Carolina provide assurances that there would be a big traditional convention. with 20,000 people in a basketball arena, basically. And just in the last day or two, the Democratic governor of North Carolina has said, we're really sorry, we can't guarantee that. We have no idea if restaurants will be open, if bars will be open, if we'll have people, be able to gather like that. And Trump has said, fine, we're going to go look for somewhere else to hold the convention, right? He needs this massive crowd. And so the trick for the Trump people is going to be finding a city and a state that both have a Republican governor and a Republican mayor who will bend at the knee and accommodate whatever Donald Trump wants. And so one city I've seen floated around for this is moving the Republican convention, which is just going to happen in 2.5 months' time, from Charlotte, North Carolina to Jacksonville, Florida, where there's a Republican state governor of Florida and a Republican mayor of Jacksonville. So look for that combination, whether or not it's Jacksonville.
Okay, I think we're going to start to round up this special edition of AIM Talks. First, I'm going to ask you, Niklas, what's your comments? What's your take on this when you listen to Jim and Kitty over there in the States?
Well, I think it is. Very, very interesting, but also frightening parts of what's happening in the U.S. now. And I don't know if it has reached you and the broader audience in America, the concern in Sweden, but also in many other countries in Europe. Even the European Commission made a statement the other day that, I mean, normally they do when it comes to condemn an election in a third world country with a dictator. But here it's really about a message to America to get your things together and stop racism and stop violence and so on. Have you heard about this? Has it reached to the American audience that there is a lot of protests, both in social media but also in traditional ways, both in Sweden and other European countries?
Well, I had heard that there was big protests in France and around continental Europe. I had not heard about the EU or the European Commission statement, but I'm not surprised. But in fact, there was a big story on National Public Radio this morning about the protests that the George Floyd movement has started in all these other countries. And again, it's not George Floyd is the lighting of the match, but it's decades and even centuries of aggrievement at racism and at inequality and at the way people are treated and the lack of respect. And I get that there are needs to change all over the world. What I'm horrified about is that the United States set a violent example instead of maybe having gone through a Truth and Reconciliation Commission and set a positive example for the world. Maybe if we don't have Trump as president in the next 4 years, we can set some positive examples for the world again instead of the negative ones.
Okay, Jim, any last thoughts from you?
Yeah, very, very quickly. It's just to underline what Kitty said. Our domestic values, racial equality, equality of expression, equality of opportunity, underpin our foreign policy. And so when you have examples like we've seen in the U.S. in the last couple of days, bringing international condemnation, even the Chinese Communist Party, for crying out loud, has condemned the United States. That's a massive problem.
Yeah, it's really interesting to talk to you guys about this very, very special situation. I think it was a really interesting talk, and I hope that Niklas and I can come back to you later because we sure want to follow what's happening over there and this really interesting, this hot summer and this really interesting autumn. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Thank you.